The focus of my presentation today is a tiny yet disturbing discrepancy in the biblical story about the binding of Isaac. After God had required from Abraham to sacrifice his only most beloved son Isaac in order to test him, and just after Abraham almost killed his own son and then stopped by a heavenly voice declaring him faithful, at that very moment, according to the Hebrew text, "Vayisa Abraham et einav vayar v'hine ayil achav ne'echaz b'svach b'karnav." That is, according to one of the most common modern English translation, when Abraham looked up, his eye fell upon a ram caught in the thicket by its horns. That's according to the Jewish Publication Society translation from 2006. Now, even if you were not following the Hebrew closely, you might notice that there is a problem in this translation. It contains a footnote, and a footnote, as we all know, means trouble. In this case, it presents the following disclosure. Reading Echad with many Hebrew manuscripts and ancient versions, text, that is the Masoretic text, Achar, that is, after. In short, this English translation does not represent the Hebrew text as presented here, but something else. So let's look into it in more detail. The reading a ram, or literally one ram, is indeed found in quite a few ancient biblical translations, such as the Greek Septuagint, the Syriac Peshitta, the Samaritan Pentateuch, and also seems to be reflected in the retelling of Genesis in the book of Exodus from around the 2nd century BCE. All of these sources reflect one way or another the Hebrew reading Ayil Echad, that is a certain ram. Exactly what one would expect here, and a quite unremarkable reading in and of itself. And yet the Hebrew text reads something different, Ayil Achar, literally something like a ram behind or after. A rather problematic reading which makes very little sense in this context and seems to reflect not much more than a scribal mistake due to the close graphic similarity between Echad and Achar. But this seemingly erroneous reading is also preserved in such ancient translations such as the Greek version of Symmachus and the Latin Vulgate, as well as we've just heard, in the Masoretic text. Or, well, is it? For we were just told that many Hebrew manuscripts do read Echad. So let's look into it. According to Benjamin Kennicott's collation of various readings of the Old Testament from the 18th century, but still irreplaceable, there are indeed between 26 to 32 witnesses that read Echad. This is a considerable number, but still a small minority out of the almost 700 witnesses which Kennicott consulted. Thus, the, statistic significance of this reading is not immediately obvious, and it becomes even more questionable when noticing that most of the manuscripts which Kennicott recorded were actually corrected to read Echad, according to the common Masoretic reading. Moreover, even the non-corrected witnesses never present the reading Echad as a Hebrew grammar would require, but are always vocalized Achad, which is unjustified in this context and probably reflects the vocalization of the but agrees with the vocalization of the reading Achad. That is, the vocalization itself can be considered an implicit correction to the common Masoretic reading. In short, while the reading Echad is materially attested in quite a few manuscripts, its textual significance is not that clear. Does it indeed preserve the ancient and seemingly correct reading? Or, considering the late date of all these witnesses, do they represent a conscious emendation of the problematic reading? Or, lastly, do they simply reflect medieval scribal glitches, which incidentally, in this case, agrees with an ancient and seemingly correct reading? The textual data in and of itself cannot help us in deciding between these possibilities, and they have to be considered in the context of the broader exegetical tradition of the Hebrew Bible. Here I refer specifically to traditions and comments contained in classical rabbinic literature produced during late antiquity and the early Middle Ages, as well as to medieval commentaries from, let us say, the second millennium onwards. In these corpora, we find multiple interpretations of the reading Achar, usually taking it in a temporal sense, one way or another, while they do not reflect any familiarity with any variant reading, not even in order to reject it. As far as the exegetical tradition is concerned, the reading echad seems to be a completely forgotten variant. And yet, there is one area on the borderline between the textual and the exegetical tradition which offers a somewhat different and more complicated picture on this subject. Let us therefore consider the evidence of Onqelos, also known as Targum Onqelos, the standard, so to speak, Jewish Aramaic translation of the Pentateuch, thought to have been composed during or somewhere around the beginning of the first millennium, that is roughly contemporaneous with early rabbinic literature. According to common scholarly opinion, Onqelos hovers between the two main rabbinic centers of late antiquity in Palestine and Babylonia, while on the one hand originating from a Palestinian milieu, where also other Targumic traditions emerged, as we will hear later. Onqelos' final revision or final reduction is thought to have taken place in Babylonia, from where comes the earliest remnants of textual evidence. However, complete textual witnesses of Onqelos are, first of all, abundant. They amount to several hundreds, and they're all late, coming from the 13th century and later. These numerous manuscripts attest to a stable text, even a very stable text, but, well, not always. Some variants do occur here and there, and some of them, as we will shortly see, can have important implications. Unfortunately, to date, there is still no critical edition or a study that addresses this vast textual corpora, and yet in my previous postdoc here at Cairo Leuven, in the framework of the ERC project TEXTEVOLVE, I conducted a comprehensive survey of a couple of hundred of Onqelos witnesses. And the following discussion is based on the result, on the findings and insights I gained during this study. So, as far as Abraham's Rem is concerned, the situation in Onqelos is as follows. According to one variant, Onqelos reads, Uzkaf Abraham Yatenoi, Batarilen, Vachza Vehadichra Achet Veilana. That is, and Abraham looked up after these things, perhaps, and saw a ram caught in a tree. This is a reading you will find in the best, that is the only critical edition of Onqelos by Alexander Sperber, and most scholarly edition which derive from it. It is also widely attested by medieval commentators from the 9th century onwards. Lastly, this is the reading attested in the majority of witnesses, 94 in my current database, which represent more than half of the textual tradition. Importantly, this is the only variant attested in witnesses of the so-called Babylonian and late Yemenite textual traditions, which are generally thought to represent a more accurate and more reliable text of Onqelos as compared to other, and particularly European, witnesses. In short, this variant, variant 1, can be considered the main reading of Onqelos, but it is not the only one. According to another variant, as far as content is concerned, this reading presents the reading Batar Ilen after this, which agrees with the Hebrew reading Achar, that is the common and problematic Masoretic reading. But the Aramaic is problematic in itself. First of all, its meaning is quite obscure. It is not clear after what Abraham saw what he saw. It is not even clear if the clause after refers to the time of Abraham's gaze or to its direction. Moreover, this Aramaic reading offers a rather forced interpretation of the Hebrew syntax, as is demonstrated by its deviation from the Hebrew word order. Whereas in the Hebrew, the word achar comes after the mention of the ram, the ayil, in the Aramaic, it was moved to before its mention. Both the vagueness of this Aramaic reading and its deviation from the Hebrew are further reflected in the emergence of several revisions of this reading. According to one revision, the words Batarilen were moved one place forward, and Aramaic now reads, and Abraham looked up and saw after these, so. According to another revision, the same words were moved after the word Dichra, ram, in exact correspondence with the Hebrew text. But now the Aramaic reads, in translation, and Abraham looked up and saw a ram after these, caught in a tree. and the Aramaic makes even less sense than through this English rendering. This latter revision in particular reflects an alignment with the Hebrew text, a phenomena which is widely attested throughout Onkelos textual tradition, which sometimes, as in this case, is carried out in a rather mechanical manner, without too much attention to the actual meaning of the resulting Aramaic word, resulting Aramaic reading. Both of these revisions also attest to a certain openness of Onkelos of Onkelos text, and to the ability of different scribes and readers to improve it according to their liking and understanding. And I will return to this point in the conclusions. Last but not least, these revisions provide further attestation to the widespread of variant 1. Taken together with the witnesses of variant 1 itself, they amount to more than 100 witnesses, which represent more than 60% of the whole textual tradition. But, as I said previously, this is not the only reading of Onkelos. According to a second variant, Onkelos reads, Uzkaf Avraham Yatenoi, Vachza Vehadichra Chad Ached Beilana. That is, and Abraham looked up and saw one ram caught in a tree. Now, of course, this reading, Dichra Chad, one ram, represents the Hebrew Ayil Echad. That is, this variant reflects a non-Masoretic reading of the Hebrew text, which is somewhat surprising in the but also, it must be stressed, attested only in a handful of manuscripts. 15 in my current database, all of them European and most of them Ashkenazi, that is coming from German and French communities. Still, this non-Masoretic reading is also reflected in a few other versions of Onkelos. In a third variant, we find both the reading Batar Ilem, after this, agreeing with Hebrew Achar, and the reading Chad, one, agreeing with the Hebrew Echad. This is by all likelihood a double reading, that is a conflation of versions 1 and 2, and it is attested in quite a few manuscripts, 27, again, most of them European. Lastly, a fourth variant presents none of the readings, Batar Ilem or Echad, and thus offers no rendering of either Echad or Achar. This lacunous version can be explained either as a conscious omission of the words Batar Ilem, which seem to have no immediate correspondence in the Hebrew text. And if this is so, then variant 4 represents one more revision of variant 1. But alternatively, variant 4 can be explained as an accidental omission of the word Chad due to its resemblance to the following word, Chad Achid. And if this is so, then variant 4 results from a simple corruption of variant 2 and actually provides some further indirect evidence for the spread of this non-Masoretic reading. Variant 4 itself is also attested only in a few manuscripts, 17 in my database, again, almost all of them Ashkenazi. Now, I know that I presented quite a lot of detailed variants and readings, mainly in order to demonstrate just how deep and intense is the textual restlessness, at least in this verse of Onkelos. And yet, these various readings can also converge into a very clear picture. On the one hand, there is the main text of Onkelos, which very likely represents its Babylonian tradition, which agrees with the Masoretic text and offers to it a rather forced interpretation. Next to it, there is the minority reading, attested mainly among European witnesses, which agrees with the non-Masoretic variant of the Hebrew text, and in fact preserves a forgotten variant, which is not attested almost anywhere else in medieval Jewish literature. How to explain this finding? Well, there are several options. One possibility is that this minority group indeed preserves the original reading of Onkelos, which in later other textual branches was corrected or aligned to the Hebrew text, perhaps resulting in a not so smooth reading. But another possibility is that this minority reading, which is attested by less reliable witnesses, actually represents a secondary influence on Onkelos, perhaps under the influence of an alternative Targum, or alternative tradition. And in order to better appreciate this last option, I would like now to move to briefly consider other Targums, particularly the so-called Targum Neofiti, the single complete representative of the Palestinian Targum tradition coming from, let us say, the mid-first millennium CE. In this case, Targum Neofiti is actually the only representative of this tradition, and it reads as follows: Untal Avraham yatinoi, bachma v'hadchav chad beilana. That is, and Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw one ram, something is missing, in a tree. In terms of wording, Targum Neofiti offers an independent tradition compared to Targum Onqelos. It is simply composed in a different Aramaic dialect. In terms of content, it again presents the reading Chad, one ram, again agreeing with the non-Masoretic variant Ayil Echad. Thus, in this respect, it corresponds to variant 2. And against this evidence, I think it is proper to conclude that variant 2 can be termed a Palestinian variant, at least in a sense that it reflects a tradition that was also known to the Palestinian Targum. This might suggest that variant 2 represents a secondary influence of the Palestinian Targum on some witnesses of Onkelos, but it can also be explained as reflecting an earlier common tradition which is preserved in these two branches, Neofiti and some witnesses of Onkelos. And with this question, or with this open possibility, I would like now to move to offer some more general conclusions and to consider the broader implications of this particular case study. First of all, some observations concerning the value of Onkelos for biblical text criticism are in place. As I tried to show to you, the subject is, well, complicated. First and foremost, because there is an urgent need for a text-critical reassessment of Onkelos, simply in order to be able to say what Onkelos actually says. But also because when such a reassessment is carried out, as in this case, it might reveal that Onkelos attests to conflicting versions. Thus, instead of supporting one variant or the other, it actually confirms the textual variance itself as a textual reality that needs to be acknowledged on its own right, at least as far as the textual basis of the Targum is considered. And still, the text critical study also supplied positive confirmation for a Hebrew variant, which is not attested almost anywhere else. Even in the direct witnesses of the Masoretic text, its attestation is quite questionable, to my mind. And this brings me to my second point, the value of the European, and specifically the Ashkenazi tradition of Onkelos. Whereas, generally speaking, Targum scholars tend to prefer the presumably more accurate and certainly more uniform tradition represented in Oriental witnesses. In this case, we saw that it is actually the European witnesses, or some of them, which preserve an ancient reading, and almost uniquely. Moreover, it appeared that this reading and quite a few other similar occasions suggest that the European witnesses represent a different branch of Onkelos, possibly a Palestinian branch. This finding has implications not only for the transmission history of Onkelos, but possibly also for understanding the last stages of its composition and its relation to rabbinic centers in Babylonia and Palestine, an issue on which I elaborated in more detail in other occasions. Last but not least, the European tradition as a whole attests to a high and intensive ongoing engagement with Onkelos. It shows how different scribes, readers, and students continually attempt to improve, adapt, and interpret the text according to their understanding, liking, literary tastes. And it is here at this point that the text critical study takes us from the area of transmission to the realm of reception. For indeed, the interferences and revisions in the text of Onkelos can be extremely frustrating when attempting to understand what was the original Greek of Onkelos, and through it perhaps also of the Hebrew Bible. But it's exactly these interferences and revisions which become extremely important when trying to understand how that received text was understood by its recipients, and how through it they understood, again, the Hebrew Bible. In view of this engagement and interference in Onkelos, we start to understand, or I think we start to understand, to see that at least for some readers, Onkelos was more than a sacred relic from those remote times when the Aramaic was commonly spoken. And it is not only a storehouse of antiquated and hallowed traditions, but it is also a relevant and meaningful means to making sense of the Hebrew Bible. And for us, it becomes precious evidence of contemporary knowledge of the Bible, of Aramaic, and of theological and exegetical traditions. This is the point when I say thank you very much and I look forward for your comments, and I will immediately say it. But before that, as some of you know, in very short, I will in about a week, I'm finishing my current postdoc much earlier than expected, and leaving KU Leuven in order to take up a new position. I know it's fun, but I'm still excited. And I wanted to take this opportunity to tell you, thank you for 6 wonderful years, for your support, for your company, for your talks. I will miss KU Leuven, and I will miss you a lot. And it is with a heavy heart, and also with high expectations, that I'm making this move. So thank you. Thank you to all of you. And as I promised, I look forward for your comments and thoughts.